there, but the audio seemed to double in my headphones. So thank you for joining. Hopefully I'm coming through clearly. So I'm got an echo from Mike there. Welcome, everyone. We have got Mike Elsmore from Infobip joining us. It's an awesome talk about you should build an SDK. Mike, thank you for joining.
No worries. You're welcome. I apologize for being in the wrong time zone for everybody.
You're in the correct time zone.
Yes, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to not falling on stage like the last time I gave this talk.
I've got a weird echo going on.
Do you have a copy of the YouTube tab open?
No.
I don't.
Oh, why is that open? I don't even remember opening that browser window.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is what you get when you have professionals doing everything.
We are professional developer advocates. We do this for a living.
This is why during the podcast I have with a certain James Second, it always starts with award-winning, because it's really not.
Well, thank you for joining us, Mike. I'm going to let you do your talk. I'm going to disappear and let you do your business. If anyone wants Mike to slow down, drop it in the chat and I'll let him know, because he won't be able to see it. He has a habit of talking very fast. So if you're struggling, shout out. We'll handle it. Other than that, have a great talk. And Mike, thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Well, thank you very much to everybody who is tuning in or watching this later. I'm really sorry for those who were watching later. You're going to miss out on the little prize at the end and the real-time fun bits in the middle. I'm just hoping there are some people live to actually have the fun bits. Otherwise, it's not going to be fun. So yes, this is Should You Build an SDK? So let's do the thing where this is me. I do DevRel at Infobip. That is developer relations. So my job is to help people build stuff and have more fun with things. Be that with Infobip as the primary goal, but in just general software development. So you can find me pretty much everywhere on the internet. Matt Els. There is my email if you want to send me some form of hate for how terrible the talk is. And just to prove how terrible and idiotic a speaker I am, I do have an NPM module with all my contact information, because why not? Next one will be probably a cargo repo, or maybe a PHP Composer package, because you know why? I need to relearn those things. So this is a QR code, obviously. It goes to a WhatsApp bot. So if you're watching live, you can interact with the talk via the means of WhatsApp. So scan this, click OK to the WhatsApp page on your camera app, and just send the first message. That way you can join the talk and the bot knows that it can communicate with you. A limitation of WhatsApp, as an FYI, is WhatsApp business accounts cannot communicate with you until you have communicated with it. And more importantly, if you don't talk to it for 24 hours, it has to leave you alone. Just as an FYI, you don't get badgered. It's great. All right, so moving on. Just to check that this is actually working. Yes, I'm even going to test it myself. So how are you doing? There we go. And that's sent. Excellent. And I am going to actually say, I am doing good. Hey! There we go. So there's at least a few people in the chat. It works! Yay! One of the things I was told by a friend of mine giving advice on giving talks is never have live demos or do live code. Haha, it works, so we can carry on. So I work at Infobip. If you've never heard of us, we are currently the world's largest telecommunications API provider with the broader set of technologies. So that means we provide email, SMS, MMS, WhatsApp, 18 different ways of communicating programmatically with end users, and where possible, receiving information through. We also have some whiz-bangery on top in the form of chatbot building. Ironically, this isn't using the chatbot builder. This is just hacked together TypeScript. But with a chatbot builder, email broadcast sending, all that lovely jazz. So that's us, which brings us into the next one. Who has actually heard of Infobip? Which is, a really nice metric of, am I doing my job well? And the answer to that is one person's heard of us. Okay, so out of the 3 people that are interacting, which one of them is me, so it's unfair, 2 people have actually heard of who the hell we are. So thank you very much. And hopefully more of you have heard of us after this. So I'm going to pull myself together and get on with this because, the introduction shouldn't take this long. But I'm also going to be doing something I never really do in talks before. I'm actually going to have a structure because usually I'm a chaos monkey. So we're going to go from what are SDKs, why you should build them, and just a little bit of guidance and general good practice and some easy to do stuff to make it less sucky. So what are we even talking about? That's an easy question to answer. So let's see how many people are sure of what an SDK is. Because surprising, in the research I went down the rabbit hole for this, I learned a few things that made me feel a little silly, and also realized I have possibly messed up in my processes, shall we say. So, okay, everybody certainly know what an SDK is. But SDK just stands for Software Development Kit. It's that simple. So it's literally a kit, a tool set for building software. Ironically, what we are used to as software engineers, most of us anyway, that's not true. So an SDK is not a client library. Yeah, all the research I did realized wrapper libraries are not SDKs. They are part of SDKs. They are there to help, but they are not the whole shebang. This is the official Wikipedia definition of what an SDK is. I'm just going to quickly ramble through it so that we can move on. A software development kit, SDK, is a collection of software development tools in one installable package. They facilitate the creation of applications by having a compiler, debugger, and sometimes a software framework. They are normally specific to a hardware platform and operating system combination to create applications with advanced functionalities such as advertisements, push notifications, etc. Most application software developer use specific software development kits. But yes. Well, if you read that, and then when you actually look through SDKs and Google around like older versions, you'll realize why client libraries aren't SDKs, they're just part of it. So this is the PlayStation 5 SDK. It is a hardware package for developing software on using the proprietary, I think it's Linux distro that the PS4 and 5 are built on. So it's, yeah, that's an SDK. It's not just a X install package. This is I believe, the Switch SDK. Once again, to develop software on it. And that's for full interaction. And one that we, as most developers, just because, well, to correct myself, developers in the last 10 years from the hackathons and all that scene, this is an SDK. It's not called a software development kit. It's a development kit, but it is there to help you develop software and the UI and interaction layer for use with an Oculus. So it is an SDK, essentially. SDKs aren't just software. It just happens to be, for the vast majority of us who work in web and mobile applications, we don't think about the hardware that it can use for the back of it. So I am one of the guys who helps maintain and do our best practices on all of our SDKs at Infobip. This is the one that I do most of my thing in because, yes, I'm a terrible TypeScript and JavaScript engineer. I'm sorry. Realization, it's not an SDK. It's a client wrapper. It doesn't do anything other than wrap our API libraries for you. Sorry. Please forgive me. I'm so sorry. So, yeah, I'm going to have to apologize. And from now on, we're pretty much in the realms of not fact, just hard-won experience and opinion. And by hard-won experience, I mean there has been some challenges that writing and developing SDKs have helped me with in the past. not just getting the product I work for in the hands of engineers like yourselves. So for pure software development kits, because I've never developed a hardware one, so I have no idea what the shindig is around all that. So for pure software development SDKs, I've just realized I put software development kits. They can be your HTTP client libraries. It can include things like webhook definitions. So if you're only ever receiving information from a application via webhook rather than like live polling and interaction, your SDK can contain the definitions to simplify the receiving of information. It can also include things like mathematical models. I've just realized the models is spelled backwards. Well, the L and the S. Oops. Should really spell check my stuff. But yeah, for example, I've seen Python libraries for Jupyter notebooks, which have included a software development kit of resource fetching information, as well as mathematical models to translate those to things that Jupyter can process easier. Those can be part of an SDK. And there's a whole bunch of other things. It is a toolkit. An SDK is an installable toolbox with a whole bunch of wonderful tools inside of it to make your job easier. So, do you agree? Now, that's a curious one, because I have a feeling that a few people are going to disagree with me on this. People disagree with me. I am surprised. Okay. Now, if you disagree with me, I would love to hear your comments and chat afterwards. And if you happen to be out in the wild on the internet after this talk, I would love for you to ping me on a form of social media and tell me, because I find it really curious. But this is where yeah, okay, cool. But so why would you build an SDK? Oh, aren't SDKs just for external developers or clients to use your stuff? That's what I originally thought many years ago. It's like, so these packages to interact with stuff, they're just essentially to sell people's code. It's how products get their things into stuff. It's how things get into frameworks, right? Well, nah. Past experience in the last only like 3 or 4 years has told me otherwise. Everybody can get an SDK. Unfortunately, my GIF editing skills didn't mean I couldn't replace the Tacker with SDK, but everybody should and could get an SDK to make their lives a lot easier. Internal and external developers all deserve the same tools for building stuff, especially in large organizations and distributed organizations, or organizations with language barrier issues where taking the time to like communicate things verbally when you have the human repository of stuff rather than the documented or codified knowledge of stuff, so much more difficult. And good money on most of us have had the issue where all the knowledge is in somebody's head, and if they're on vacation, you're pretty much scuppered. Everybody deserves the same set of tools and information to do the thing. But why? Why would that be important? Well, I don't really have evidence for this. This is, once again, in the point where it's kind of hand-wavy in my opinions and just stuff. Sorry. But it's well-informed and has some hard-won experience behind it. These are just my opinions. So let's go through my reasoning for this, just to make life a little easier. Yep, once again, blah, 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 blah. APIs are hard. People say, no, they're really easy to stand up and use and whatnot. And in reality, they're right. APIs are well-defined these days. There are standards and practices that we all use and we all manage, and tooling for every language and framework and product and output that can be consumed. But there's also a whole bunch of different standards and everything. Like, we've got REST. So for most of us, that just looks like a JSON object, a JSON response and request set. It can, or even just XML. You've got GraphQL, which is an entirely different but valid and over the same protocol levels of communication. We're talking just HTTP here. We're not even talking gRPC or any other form of like protocol. This is just HTTP for APIs. And it's already like that. We have SOAP. Some of you will be too young to have ever used SOAP, but back in the day, SOAP was everywhere and it was the default for doing scaled APIs. But the thing is, things like governments and large corporate entities still have these APIs buried in them because they work and they don't need to be touched or maintained for that reason. So there's no point upgrading them. And B, they work. That's pretty much the only reason. And it's kind of like the fact you find out there's a 20-year-old server buried somewhere running DNS and you're really worried the hard drives are going to fail. But it works. But yeah, this is just the HTTP APIs. And we already have 3 largely known standards. We're not even talking about WebSockets, which is another version, MQTT protocols. We're already just HTTP, and it's already got this mixed level of information and like different ways of interacting. SDKs do lower the learning curve. With modern IDEs, I don't care if you're using NeoVim, Visual Studio, etc. There's things like IntelliSense, or just direct linking to documentation, or just object expansion for seeing how information is passed into an SDK. Makes it so much simpler for you to be able to, as a new person coming towards a product, who is, I don't know if you could be like me, I hate reading the API spec. Open API spec, beautiful thing. Reading it to learn how it works to begin with, I always find daunting because of just how big they are. And this is talking from Infobip, where we have a huge one that scares the living bejesus out of me, and I have to translate that into an SDK, so just saying. And it does speed up implementation. If you import an SDK, somebody has done the forethought for how to do things like the authentication level, how to handle a response, how to build out the structure. All you need to do is follow the input pattern, and you don't have to write everything. In your average, say, Guzzle or Axios request, to make one simple one-line GET request to an API, it's probably at least 200 characters wide, or if you're breaking it down into a sensible line, it's at least 4 lines deep, and that's just to send the request. That's not even to process the response. And that's not even including things like authorization headers, etc., that you could send through, or OAuth handshakes to start the, or bearer token handshake. Then SDK could be a one-liner. Giving that to a new engineer internally or externally will help them go from 0 to something much faster. And it's, in my opinion, more advantageous to have a senior engineer spend time defining and constructing a well-formed SDK than repeatedly explaining to somebody who is new to the team or new to development in general how to structure the request. If they can have a one-liner and then go back and learn for themselves, fantastic. But it just makes them more predictive faster. And it provides a consistent interface regardless of API schema. So if you've worked in an organization which has multiple different silos of product or multiple different silos of team who work very differently, and sometimes that means things like naming conventions slip through, or entire structures are different between one product and the next product, or one API and the next API. That shouldn't be the case. We all know that shouldn't be the case, but it happens. It's happened at Infobip as well, and they've spent a lot of time before I joined the company, and whilst I've been there, I've seen huge progress into the unification of the APIs and how they work. But it still hasn't finished and resolved because we support large enterprises, so we can't change things on the flip of a coin. For example, most of our APIs are like the SMS API here that you can see, which is a lovely simplified JSON object payload that you send over via your insert language here, and a well-defined thing, and it's asynchronous, so we have to get and fetch and all that jazz. This is what most of us expect from an API, and it's fantastic. We still have this, which is our email API. It only accepts multi-part form data. There is no JSON, it is all via this. So we are a large organization. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of developers and SREs and quality assurance engineers, etc. But because we are so big and we are split over time zones and teams and knowledge levels and languages, this has slipped through sometime in the past and we haven't had a chance to update it yet. An SDK means that you have a continuous and singular way of interacting. The objects you create or the structures and types you create in your SDK can then be translated to the different methods and different APIs that are underneath it, making life a lot easier. So, who has built an SDK? Now, this is going to be really curious. So, who's watching this? Who builds APIs? Most of us do if we work in the web. But who's actually built an SDK or even just a client library to do stuff? So, we have one who's built an SDK. Excellent. So, I feel like I'm telling everybody who's watching this talk to suck eggs. I'm sorry if I'm not giving you anything new or anything to think about. You're just, yep, already know, bud. Thanks very much. Damn it. I'm sorry. Maybe next time I'll have something more beneficial for you. But, okay. For those of you who haven't, and this is something that I would like you to think about, regardless of if you're live here or watching this in months' time, are these good enough reasons for you to think about building an SDK for your internal teams or for your external clients or not? Just have a think about it. And if you do, remember to put them in the comments for the YouTube video. I'll keep an eye on them and Steve will tell me off if I've made a big one. So, surprisingly, everybody thinks it's a good idea. Okay. I feel vindicated. So, why would you build one? I'll be asking this at the end. So, if you have any comments or questions or anything, feel free to drop it there. Or once again, just chat to me on the interwebs. So, tell me how you build it. We've done the what they are. We've done the why. Here's a really short and simple set of things you should think about when you're building the SDKs. Use instructions in your given framework and language. I've spelled language wrong. Really should add some form of spell checker to my IDE for my slides. Excellent. If you're building something, use the defined patterns of the language. Your language may be a DI-based language like C#, which loves having DI, or TypeScript, which also likes it. Most languages have DI, but not always. But if you're building something for external people, you may want to allow them to modify the actual HTTP client themselves, because they may be putting it behind firewalls, etc., where they need to have proxy points and whatnot. So the ability to modify and tinker with that in a way that is expected for the language or framework is important. Regardless of how you as an engineering team feel, it should follow how the language and framework is used in the wild already, rather than the opinions of the people internally. The opinions of the people internally are important and they help define the overall scope of things. But if the point of an SDK is to simplify the onboarding and use of tooling and thus underlying technologies, they should be behaving more like the default native way expected by people in the wild. The way to think of it is, how would somebody who's never looked at this use it if they've only read the documentation for the language or framework that has been implemented? Not how somebody who's been working for you for 6 months would think about it. Use a namespace where possible. This one's quite important because SDKs, as I've been looking into it and how I'm going to be redesigning the SDKs I work with, some of them can become huge and unbearably complicated. This is Fastify, sorry. Fastify is the framework I'm using for the web app that you're actually communicating with me via WhatsApp on. And all of its individual components are namespaced so that you can have the bits of their development kit that you require to do the job at any one time. If they were to give this as one large package, you would end up having a huge dependency chain of things underneath the hood and just a bundle. The bundle would be inherently giant unless you use a wonderfully static a language of static analysis which can remove all that dead tree nonsense. But most aren't that great, and by default not turned on. So imagine how much there would be in the background if you didn't namespace it so that you can only include the components and pieces you wanted. Just think about that. If you're writing a client library, which is, to be fair, is going to be most of us and how we interact, follow a bloody standard. Try and look at either the JSON API, hypermedia standards, but follow a standard and consistency across your APIs. I pointed out the issue with the Infobip ones previously. This makes an SDK pretty much a requirement rather than just a beneficial thing for end users. For somebody to interact with the Infobip ones, unless we want to have people getting very confused when they switch from one API to another, an SDK is a requirement. But say you're a very young company and you scale very quickly and you have APIs by the day, by the week, you can't always reliably get an SDK written and included in that time. So follow a standard so that people can add and manipulate regardless of what the SDK is doing. And absolutely, please, for the love of God, if you can't document everything, I mean everything. Great, if you're using an open API spec, use something like Redoctly to describe it and help validate your work. But make sure you document everything, any edge case, any piece of material, add into a Confluence, a wiki, something shareable and common. I know this is telling people that like, oh, we all know to do that. How many people remember to do that before somebody asks a question? When things are moving quickly, it's always an afterthought. Make sure you document everything, including the internals of the SDK. If there's any weird behaviors, anything like, oh, we had to put in a really weird while loop to wait for things because there's a chain of dependencies that we can't get around. Make sure it's documented so that when somebody needs help, you have something to help them. It's okay to use generators. There will be certain people in the world of developer experience, etc., that will disagree with me on this, but generators are fine. At Infobip, the vast majority of our libraries are built from generators. They're custom templates under the hood, but they are generators. We are currently, I will admit, we have the hand-rolled SDKs, which I help build, but we're also moving to a hybrid approach where we have the lovely interaction layer, so the initial client part that's going to be hand-rolled so everybody knows what to expect, and then all the routes and types done automatically, because why write them manually when you can do that automatically and we can define the templates by which they are written? Generators are fine. They help get things through the door. Some people don't like the final product that generators produce because they are purist and not simple. The developer experience is still as hard as trying to write an API itself. But not always. And you can manipulate and change them as you'd like. A generator, you can manage the code as well as you can your API. And if you're using an open API thing, you can use their generators. There is specification and the tooling to do everything for you already out there. SDKs can be really, really easy for the client library components. And if you don't like them, well, you can be a craftsman and like organizations I know where you do everything by hand. And you do end up with a far superior product, but a lot more engineering time. So think about the balance of how much time your engineering team has and how much effort there is to produce. So, do I need to remind you of anything? Version control everything. I don't care how you do it. You can do it in the weird date format in the older AWS SDKs. It could be in full major minor patch versioning of your APIs. It could be just major versioning with minor patches. It could be in the header. I do not care how you version your API to work with your SDK. I don't care how you version your SDK. Your SDK really should follow Semver for the language you're using, preferably. But I don't care how you do it, as long as it's versioned, so that when somebody is coming through and we're trying to work out why something's not working, they can look at the SDK version, find out what client library version that is, or even just if there's been patches or fixes on top that fix the problem for them. There's a lot of programs and applications on the internet which are running old dependency chains, and they're not updated regularly. They're pre-SNCC and tooling to automatically do that. So make sure your API and your SDK are independently version controlled. I don't care how you do it, but make sure they are. Oh, and on the previous topic, use dependency management. If you have an SDK, you're unlikely to be hand-rolling everything. You're likely to be using a test runner, which can introduce bugs in itself. You're liable to be using a HTTP client that's a known standard. In PHP, that could be Guzzle. In Node, that could be Fetch with its variants, Axios. Use dependency management to check the versions of those are not introducing bugs themselves. So you don't have, when there is a security flaw, you can move on quickly and everything will be wonderfully dealt with. So make sure you use them. And if you can, I know this is not always possible, especially due to the way that some proprietary code works and how it has to be stored in X and Y. Make sure you can have some static analysis tools. SonarQube is wonderful, has a brilliant open source version and is affordable for most teams that are running at product scale. Make sure you can do some analysis. It'll save you a lot of pain and make things simpler. Some languages like PHP, which I keep referencing, even though I'm not a PHP guy, have things like PHP Standard, which does a lot of the work in the open source for you. But then there are other products for other languages that can automate the flow and just make things easier for you to work out when something's going wrong in your SDK. So try and use them when you can. So, and one last tiny piece of advice. Try not mixing the languages and frameworks in the SDK. It makes it so much harder in the long run. This is hard-won experience, by the way. Trying to work out if it is a component X or component Y, because some of the tooling doesn't work in multi-languages. For example, if you have a React component that's talking to a C# client library inside the same bundle because it goes in the same framework and gets split out, can't always work out which part of it is breaking because the tooling may not be able to, oh, we can't do static analysis on this. There's two languages and we can't coincide them. So try and separate them. Hence the namespace thing. If you can separate them, you can treat things as individual units of work. Just makes life a lot easier. So let's see. Did anybody find any of this information useful? I really hope you did. I really hope you did. If not, I'm sorry. So yes, somebody found something useful. I will take that. The win for me. Somebody found it useful. Oh yeah, coffee. Now, here's a bit more important one. Was that a little funny? The last time I developed this talk, I literally fell over on stage, and most people found that more funny than me delivering it. So, was it funny? Oh, nobody's found it funny. That's yay, somebody smiled. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. So, if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out. And just as the last time, if anybody's still in the chat, so I can remember to send you a €20 coupon for messing around with our stuff, just send me a message so I can not email you, send you a WhatsApp with the code later after this talk. That's everything. Thank you very much. Steve, you're up.
And I'm still here.
Oh, at least you didn't ghost me.
I didn't, but I did add a nice banner for you. That generators make Steve cry.
Now, is that because you're using them without modifying them for what you need?
Yes and no. It's more, I've seen generators, I've seen custom generators, and each time they just hurt. They just make it so, there's no finesse to them, you know.
You're correct, and I would agree with you, especially on a product like Treblle, where they are small and well-defined units of work. You have, on the outside and internally, probably 50 to 100 endpoints at the top end?
Yeah, give or take. Give or take.
We have nearly 300, and that's not including the internal ones. That's just our public open API spec.
Yeah, I mean, if you're kind of doing that SDK after the fact, I think using a generator to get the scaffold there to go in and fine tune for that developer experience.
Yeah,
that's the lesser of the two evils.
I used to agree with you, and then I started working with a huge product and realized generators where you can define and write the templates for well-defined types and routes make life so much easier. Then you only need to care about the actual interaction layer, and that's the thing that you should put your engineering time into.
We have one question so far.
Oh, hit me.
From our good friend Jim. Outside of the Node ecosystem, which has a ridiculous amount of packages, should you aim for as few dependencies as possible in your SDK?
Yes. If only because if you're giving this to an external user, not an internal one, you want to introduce as few points of pain or issue for them. Certain organizations have issues with the library licenses used. MIT, perfect license. GPL3, highly invasive virus. Thank you, beardy people. It's not even just the code itself. The licensing, the structures, the code of conduct with the behavior of certain libraries could introduce issues and behavioral things that you don't want in your code. So as few as possible, yes. But hand-rolling everything yourself does mean that you then have to spend, as in like hand-rolling your HTTP client, means you then have to spend forever making sure that you are following every spec to the letter, which is a lot of engineering time that somebody else has spent a lot of time on, probably got a lot more right than you.
Yeah. I mean, that's why, for example, in PHP, I typically lean towards PSR 18, which is, that interoperable interface. I lean on that one. I then allow, in my talk earlier, I was using that. And then what you do is you install a dev dependency. So you've got something that can kind of be discovered and you can write your tests using it. But then when you install it into your application, you bring your own HTTP client as long as it is meeting the standard that you're building your SDK to.
PSR 18 is amazing for like an enforced approach to dependency injection for HTTP clients. Yeah. I really hope that PHP doesn't do that to everything because then that's overly enforced opinion on stuff. But for HTTP clients, where you want to know the exact behavior regardless of the library you're using, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, some PSRs are good, others not so much. But that was our main question, I guess. I will throw a question out there.
Hear me.
So it's along the same lines as what Jim is talking about. Let's say I'm building an SDK for something with multiple services. I'm going to talk through an API gateway, and I want to be able to talk to individual services. Now, typically, what you might do is build an SDK for each main service that you might communicate with. Notice I'm not using microservice as a name there. Think of it like a specific version of a product. So for you, it could be a voice, or it could be audio, two different kind of types. If I wanted to build that, would I build separate packages or one package as an SDK?
Now, this is why I specifically pointed out quite early in the how part about namespacing. Depending on your language, because this is a language thing as well based upon how it tree shakes, etc. I would, if it's a language which does allow for static analysis and the tree shaking of dead branches that you don't require, one bundle with namespaces within said bundle so you can include just the component you need. Because why introduce a whole bunch of mess that you then have to debug and fix later? But for languages or structures which don't allow for that level of flexibility from the build processes, you may want to build them as individual SDKs and then have a container SDK. So you would want individual client wrapper components, which are then included inside of an SDK. That's the reason why SDKs and client libraries are not one for one, because an SDK can contain multiple client libraries and client wrappers.
Okay, I suppose that answers that. So it's something that I've always wondered, because I mean, a lot of the SDKs that I've built have been directly for a single service. Occasionally, I've built one where I might have two, and I do some kind of magic around swapping the kind of HTTP transport layer of how I'm talking to it. So that leads me on to the second question that I have. When you're building an SDK, do you only support HTTP? And if you're going to support more than just HTTP, would you build them as separate packages, or would you have them as separate transports within your one package that you can use as required?
Now, ironically, this is something I've actually done inside the last 18 months. So ironically, I was working for a company that sounds really similar to my current company. I was working for a company called InfoSum for a little while. Amazing company. They are a Go shop. And instead of defining everything as a HTTP layer, they defined everything as a gRPC layer. All communication was done at that point. So the internal SDK, which I helped do the developer experience around, was entirely just gRPC. But when that hit the gateway and the actual point of access to the internet, it was all converted to HTTP only. You couldn't communicate with the system in gRPC. You could only communicate via HTTP because the security layer had been locked down so that only that as a protocol could be used. So we essentially used the gRPC stuff with a conversion point to create the HTTP request from it. So we stacked them. Internally, the build tool built the HTTP library based upon the manually constructed gRPC.
Okay, so you built a generator based off of basically protobufs, right?
A buck ton of protobufs.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, I mean, maybe could you explain that like I'm five for anyone watching who may not be as familiar with that terminology as I am?
Okay, so gRPC is a real-time communication layer which can actually have long-lived connections. So HTTP, as most of us are aware, have a lifespan. I believe the upper limit is about 5 minutes for best practice. I know you can have enforced longer running ones, but the best practice is about 5 minutes. gRPC can be treated more like a tunnel where it can communicate X and Y simultaneously, and you can feed via the gRPC the return gRPC tunnel, so it can become a two-way street via one communication like pipeline. There's no handshaking to back and forth of separate requests. It's one request that can handle all of it. Now, the way you define gRPC is via a thing that is called protobuf. Protobuf is a very, 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 pretty much as old as me, I think, protocol. I think it was originally designed in like the mid 1980s, I think, originally, as its definition, not its usage, its definition. As with all things on the internet, there's no such thing as originality. It's all just old and repackaged. Now, protobufs are just a definition of communication between X and Y. Protobuf, I don't know if there is a way of actually communicating with just protobuf. I thought protobuf has to be converted to something else as natural transport layer. I think.
Yeah, protobuf is just a message definition contract.
Yeah, it's a validator essentially for inbound and outbound types essentially, and it's very expressive. Yeah, so I think that's the best definition I could give. Having never actually built gRPC myself, just built on it, because I'm a terrible Go engineer.
I love Go. It's actually my favorite language, but not the language I use the most.
It is the one that gives it hurts my brain as much as Rust, but I love when it works. It is beautiful.
I don't mind Rust. Rust just feels like someone was writing Python and it tripped over the keyboard to me.
Sorry.
We'll go into that one.
Yeah, let's avoid that, Mike. No, that should be definitely a conversation with multiple people around a pub and a microphone.
Yes.
But
well,
yes.
Mike, thank you for that. That was fantastic. I may not completely agree with you. And funnily enough, Jim gave a talk earlier in the day, which was along the same lines, but you both have very different opinions on this, which is great. Having that difference is really interesting to see, with two experienced developer advocates. It's really useful to see how different people approach these specific problems when it comes to SDKs for an API and that sort of stuff. So
I think I have to own up. I've only built 12 or 15 SDKs for different open source projects and products, so I don't have that much experience.
You've got a lot more than some.
Yes, true. But there are people out there who've been doing it is their primary job, and they've been doing it a lot longer than me in different languages for different organizations, different products. And I will always defer to them. And this is why I said most of this is an opinion.
The developer relation gods look down on us and inform us every now and then.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to let you get on with the rest of your day because I don't even know what time zone you're in right now.
It's 10 a.m. almost for me, so I can go and have snacks.
Cool. Well, I will leave you to snack. Again, thank you. Make sure you like and comment. Anyone who's got questions, have a great day all, and catch you next time. Bye-bye.